Hi, everybody. I'm Agree,
I'm Harrison.
and this is Bottom Line Design. And today's episode, we've got a long running friend of mine, an old friend of mine, Kasey Klimes, on the show. So, Kasey, among many things, is the founder of Rhizome R&D. Do you want to give a quick intro on yourself, Kasey, and sort of your background?
Sure. So I started. There's the long version and the short version. I'll try to give something in between. Started my career actually in political science. Worked on some political campaigns once upon a time. A guy named Barack Obama was involved, and then I ended up moving into urban design. And lived in Copenhagen for several years, working for an urban design firm over there. Worked on all sorts of urban design projects in cities like Moscow and Sydney and Oslo and you name it. And then ended up in the tech world working on Google Maps, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about, as a researcher for world scale augmented reality. And then I ended up leaving Google to go independent. This is Rhizome R&D, the consultancy that I founded a little over 2 years ago. And effectively, it's product strategy and design research consultancy. So I tend to work with early stage teams who are developing kind of new products and ideas in generally more emerging technologies in all sorts of different fields. And so that's what I do more or less right now.
Okay, amazing. And
So many questions.
so many questions, and I feel like there's actually even like, listen, because I'm a Kasey super fan. I got the Expando subscription, and so like I know there's also like the origin even before the political campaigns was audio engineering, right?
Oh well, yeah. When I was a teenager, that was how I spent most of my time. Yeah, recording local bands in my parents' basement. So yeah, I like the diffusers that are behind you guys. Looks like you have a nice audio setup.
Oh, we
Yeah,
love the velvet voice from your side.
yeah. But like you're now maybe at least the second guest that we've had on, maybe the third who has their origin story, their creative origin story in music. Do you think that there's like a
Mhm.
there? What's going on?
I mean, I think music is a very accessible creative outlet for especially young people, and it's a very communal thing. And of course, at that age, everything is about, just different ways of hanging out with your friends, right? So I think that makes sense. I think too, at that point in time, especially on the audio side, it was kind of the first moment where home audio recording was actually accessible to a lot of people. Um, I was a little bit of a purist and wanted everything to be super analog, but because that was out of fashion, that kind of stuff was cheap too. So you could get reel to reel, decks and things like that for relatively cheap. Um, and it was so much fun, and it was kind of an opportunity for experimentation, uh, both creatively on the music side and also technologically. Like so much of the fun we were having at that age was, how do we get the weirdest sound possible? How can we what can we get away with here in this dinky little recording studio that we've pieced together? And actually, this is a funny topic for a podcast, but I'll tell you about the first time I bought a condom, which was at that age. We wanted to make a piano sound like it was underwater, and so we had this upright piano, and we got a bucket of water, got a microphone, got a condom, wrapped it around the microphone, and dunked it in the water and put it on top of the piano. And it sounded so cool. It was so eerie. It sounded like you were on a submarine, deep in the Pacific, and somewhere out in the water, there's mermaids playing piano. It was so weird and beautiful. And we got it on recording for maybe 2 minutes or so when the condom broke. And I was in the studio listening as I hear this little and the whole thing shorts out, and I lost my, it was like $100, $200 microphone. But for me, that was a really valuable item at that time. And yeah, so, we were just always trying to see what we could get away with. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And I think that's a great test bed for creative work.
Yeah. Wait, do you have the audio files still of the...
I don't know if I have that one. I'd have to dig pretty deep.
That's
deep in the archive.
That is so worth the dig. Yeah. I mean, listen, if it costs like 200 pre-pandemic bucks and it was like, that's like a sound file almost like paid for in blood at that point, right? Like, that's serious.
Yeah.
It is a nice connection, though, that people in music do end up going to design. And what I like about you as a guest is you're our first like hardcore UX researcher. You're a researcher, right? And
yeah, very much so.
I think a lot of people, when they think about design or product design, in the Silicon Valley space, is like, how can we make things look pretty? How can we make things, a great, delightful experience?
How can we make it pop?
How can we make it pop?
Yeah.
And form follows function, and research is definitely providing the function. And what I like about, researchers like yourself is you remove all the mystery. You're able to come into teams, you're able to come into problems with data and questions, probably the questions first before the data, right? That's right. Love that. It's a very diplomatic role. And just before we hopped on the call with you, I was just talking to Agree about it. I'd love to hear, like, how do you walk into situations where, because I'd imagine that teams call you just to like be the gavel, but in like the softest way possible. Can you just describe how you actually come into problems, and like, what are those first questions? What are you trying to understand first? And then where do you go?
So I am a huge believer in understanding the problem before we start to build solutions. And I think that sounds, when you say it like that, it sounds very obvious. Like, of course you should understand the shape of the thing before you start to build. But it's not the norm.
Yeah.
As you know, that is not the usual way of doing things. It's sort of shoot first, aim later most of the time.
Actually, just a quick line on that. For all the founders watching, we see it all the time in calls. Founders always start off with these hunches for an MVP or something, and they come in with pre-baked ideas. And for any founders listening out there, always be questioning your assumptions. Even if you are an expert in the field, always be questioning your assumptions.
I just want to also chime in on this. I've only encountered 3 types of founders in my entire life. In my entire life on this subject, I've only encountered 3 types of founders. Either someone who's in the middle of wasting several years of their life chasing these hunches. He shuddered because we used to be that, right? So either someone who's in the middle of wasting several years of their life hunch chasing, someone who has done that and has those years of like failure and obscurity that they never want to go back to, or like a legitimate prodigy, like a product savant that just somehow like came out of like school or whatever, and like age 22 they just know they have to become a subject matter expert before they build one single pixel. I've never seen anything but those 3. So yeah, Kasey, tell us about like what is it like being that delicate gavel,
Yeah, it's funny because I think as a independent consultant, it's tough because the client has to be kind of already in a hard spot to be calling a consultant in the first place, right? And usually that means, okay, we were that first kind of founder, and now we're realizing it's not working. And so there's usually, as a consultant, there's some sort of mess to clean up. I like to get in before the mess is made, and I don't mean to say that everyone's always making messes. There are, as you point out, there's some founders out there that do great work before they start building. And save themselves a lot of heartache and pain and suffering along the way. But starting, like, ideas are really cheap, especially now. And now that we have, AI and all these things that increase the cycle time of processes in building and enablement, ideas are relatively cheap. questions are really hard. And I think part of that is that we don't learn how to ask good questions out of the gate. I think part of the process of I'll just build something and see if it works, even if building it takes several months or longer, and who knows how much money, is that in school, the way we were taught the scientific method is come up with a hypothesis in the shower or in a brainstorm or your investor buddy had an idea, and then go test that hypothesis and confirm or deny it. And hopefully, in the good version of that, you at least have the wherewithal and awareness to be aware of when your hypothesis has been denied. A lot of people still have blinders on even when the data is telling them otherwise at that point. But I'm a pretty firm believer that there's a better way than that. The problem, it's to some degree, the problem is that we were never taught in school how to generate a good hypothesis. And that's an inductive process, not a deductive process. Usually people are only taught inductive processes if they went to grad school for some social science stuff, and in that case, there's a whole other, it's really hard to go from that into product stuff because there's a whole other bag of trappings that goes with that sort of education and thinking.
Explain the difference between an inductive and a deductive process for forming a hypothesis.
Yeah, so think about it as bottom up versus top down. So a deductive process is starting from the top. I have this assertion. I'm going to go collect a bunch of data, and that data is going to tell me whether or not that assertion is true or false. An inductive process, one of my favorite examples of it is a process called grounded theory, which was developed by some guys and some social scientists in the 1960s. And they were actually exploring the dynamics around communicating death in hospital settings and hospice care facilities and things like that. And the beauty of it is they go in without any sort of preconceived notions. In fact, in the most purest form of that method, there's no literature review that you even do beforehand. You just go in with really open-ended probing. And the open-endedness is important because you actually, you need to interrogate the problem space, but you don't know what the problem is yet, and you don't really know what questions to ask. And so it's this, it's a level of gray and murkiness that I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable with. And that's one of the biggest challenges I have, working with the teams that I work with, is kind of helping them admit that, yes, there's an incredible ambiguity here, but also giving them the tools and techniques and processes to march through it together and get to clarity by first embracing that ambiguity. And so by sort of that open-ended exploration, you're able to start to piece together a theory, a hypothesis, a sort of causal explanation for particular dynamics in the, and I know I'm speaking in really abstract sort of academic terms, but that's the approach by which you start to get to, there is a dynamic here that could be improved. There is a design opportunity, and it's actually grounded in a firm evidence-based understanding of real people's lives in real contextual settings. And the context is also really important. I think a lot of even research, to be honest, tends to ignore broader contexts. So, for example, we might be building a enterprise SaaS tool, and we're so focused on the interactions of the individual and the tool design itself, like you said, like making things easy and delightful and user friendly, which is all, and the pop, we need the pop. So we get a little bit focused on that, right? A little bit narrow-minded. And we forget that this is a work environment with office politics, and we don't think to ask, wait, how are people promoted here? Because that could totally influence user behavior of this tool. There's an ecology, so to speak, of dynamics and other people and systems and rules and culture that informs all the real user experience, which is far above and beyond just a person and a tool. This very simplified HCI model that tends to get a little bit abused. So anyway, yeah, a lot of my work is about helping teams identify what those core questions are to start with. And I like workshops for this. So I've developed a few different kinds of workshops that I'll invite teams into. And it's really about making sure that we have a complete map of what we know and don't know. Because a lot of times teams,
and what
they
you're
have all
what you're
this.
saying right now is this is the beginning of the process. So
Yeah, very beginning of that process.
Okay. So you come into the team and you're like, hey, we need to figure out what we do know and what we don't know. And that's literally like just the first place that you start. And you're kind of like the shepherd. Okay.
That's right. And what's interesting about that is, obviously it does a lot for me in terms of, basic client discovery, getting me on board with where we're at in this process, because I'm not there on day one. But it also helps the team understand what they do and don't know as well, because a lot of times these teams, they have a lot of information kind of floating around. Some of it's based on research, some of it's based on hunches, but they don't really have a sense of what the epistemic status of any particular assertion. And yet they operate on it as if it might be gospel. And so by getting the team all together, a cross-disciplinary team, to get together and talk about, okay, what are the affordances and constraints of the technology that we have at our disposal, truly? What do we know and what do we just guess about that? What are the, in the context, what risks might be presented? So when I was working on augmented reality, world-scale augmented reality at Google, the context was incredibly risky because you're out in the city. Our users were out in the city, and you have fast-moving vehicles around them, quite literally. So, that context introduces all sorts of kind of intervening variables, so to speak. And we had to take into account things like the glare of the sun on the phone when you hold it up, which if you're just kind of working in a vacuum, you don't even think about that. And then, of course, the user themselves. What are their needs? What are their mental models? What's sort of the filter they interpret the world through? And approaching all of that through a sort of an epistemic process of understanding, okay, what do we know across all of this? And what do we really just operate on as a guess? And what do we really need to know? And out of that, developing core questions that can guide a research process that actually focuses on the core need. Because ultimately, we want to make sure that we're asking questions that get us to reducing the risk of the whole enterprise, right? So this whole process, we could ask questions all day, but we also want to triage those questions to make sure that they're really well articulated and they are the most high impact questions. And so there's sort of a workshop that I do with teams, the 2-day workshop that I call the alignment workshop. It could be called anything, but it kind of is about aligning teams up front and then moving into research from there. And that's a process that it's useful for me in terms of getting me up to speed really quickly with the team, like I said, but it's also really useful for the team in getting them aligned on what do we know, what do we not know, what questions do we really need to answer, how should we articulate those questions. And it's sort of, it's like anything in computer science, garbage in, garbage out. If you put bad questions into the process, you're going to get a terrible outcome. If you put really high quality, high impact questions in, you're going to learn a lot in the end. So that's kind of the critical moment for me in a lot of the work that I do.
Wow. I feel like there's already going to be a part 2. Like, I'm just like calling it right now.
Let's do it.
Like a lecture at RISD. I'm like just sponging it all in. I honestly just want to have you like talk and me just listen, but I do have questions.
So the mics.
when you are asking what do we know and what we don't know, obviously you're not, I mean, maybe you start like that, but like what are some of these follow-up questions, these parallel questions that you're asking the team, and who are some of these stakeholders that are coming into this room?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it really depends on the team and depends on where they're at in their process. So I might work with a more mature team, for example, that's not quite as new. So I was working recently with Sidewalk Labs. They have been around a while. And I mentioned the ambiguity that teams are dealing with. There's a very human side to that.
Sorry, Kasey, just for the people who don't have context, to save them like having to pull out their phone on the subway to Google this, what is Sidewalk Labs?
If you know the history, that's kind of a loaded question. Sidewalk Labs was an Alphabet project. Alphabet, the umbrella owner of Google. It was an alphabet, so to speak, that argued for the application of technology in cities and was exploring ways to basically create smart cities. And that term is very loaded. They had a project in Toronto that was sort of going to be the test bed of a lot of new technologies. That project ended up not being completed for a variety of reasons. And then it was in 2021 or maybe early 22 that they were brought into Google, kind of folded in for a bunch of other reasons. And now I don't know if Sidewalk Labs TM technically exists. It might be. It's gone through a lot of evolutions. It's now inside Google, and that was part of the challenge that team had was
Okay, so
kind of everything they'd been through.
literally in your answer is using the vocabulary is context about the organizational trajectory of Sidewalk Labs. And I can't even imagine, like you think of like building a product almost as like playing chess on like a cruise ship, right?
Yeah.
And then like what happens when that cruise ship like runs into either choppy waters or the ship itself needs to make a tight turn? Like how do you keep those pieces in place? Like,
Agreed. Cruise ships are incredibly stable.
That's true, they are. But sometimes also like, what we think of like as a cruise ship is like a techno-industrial accomplishment, right? Of like Carnival Cruise or like Norwegian Cruise Lines or any of these stocks that I hope that you guys bought in March of 2020. But like sometimes it's also like it's a little bit more like a dinghy, and you still have to play chess there, and the waters get a lot choppier. So like, okay, so you did one of these alignment workshops with Sidewalk Labs.
I did a bit with them, but I can kind of talk in broad brushstrokes about clients, but of course everything is everything I do is under strict NDA, which makes me a terrible podcast guest. So I only get to speak in abstractions, but with a lot of the teams, and especially mature teams that have just been through a lot, there's, to your point, agree, it's not just the product, it's the people behind it and the vehicle that product is being delivered through. And one of the interesting realizations I had a few years ago was that almost all the exact same tools and techniques that I apply as a researcher for understanding people to in turn develop products for, or designs of public spaces back when I was in urban design, can also be used, can kind of be turned around on the team itself. And we can understand the needs of the team and its dynamics. And honestly, this sort of ends up with me becoming a therapist. It's a bit funny to be on a podcast where I'm being asked questions because I'm almost always the one asking questions, but I'll hang in here. And so, it ends up being a lot about, understanding team dynamics and people on the team that are developing the products, just as much as it is about, the users of the tools themselves. And that was a really powerful realization for me, because it meant that I can begin to address the choppy waters, the dinghy in the choppy waters, right? And not just the game of chess that we happen to be playing on that dinghy. And so that was pretty huge, and that's become a large part of my work as well, is kind of, I don't want to say just being a team therapist. It's team therapist in service of both team and product. Getting a better sense of where the team is and is going, and where there might be rifts in the team and different perspectives, and kind of supporting that collaboration through really focused listening, and then fusing that with product strategy.
I have a usability question for you, Kasey.
Okay.
Have you heard the quote from Upton Sinclair that it is impossible to make a man understand something when his salary is predicated on him not understanding it, or whatever the paraphrase is?
Yeah.
Have you run into this in the field, where you basically have almost like an information processing challenge that's the core of it comes from the fact that like the person who, or the class of person who you're trying to get to process or digest or know this information, it almost like feels like the insight runs against the grain of their economic incentives. That you brought up like promotion cycles or things like this. Harrison and I were talking about this earlier.
Sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, right. Harrison and I were talking about this earlier, right before you got on the call, is like how like there are classes of like product insights that just go anathema to the way that an organization may have already built up its muscle tissue. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you ever run into that? What and if so, like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we can give an example, like if it's helpful, like for our listeners, like there was this one time when Agree and I were working with a client way back when, and in order to build a more efficient workflow, we had to get information that the from the people that the workflow would ultimately replace or
Free
make
them up to do other
free
stuff,
them up to
really.
do other stuff,
Yeah.
but they saw it maybe as competitive. So there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
like gatekeeping that happened.
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
find the key to unlock that gate?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so this is a really big issue. I think the larger the company is, the more this happens. Because in large companies, there's enough of a buffer between cause and effect that things can start to become a little kayfabe. If you're familiar with that term from wrestling, where it's more about performance than it is the actual thing. And whereas with a smaller, a startup, you're very in touch with reality, kind of or hopefully by nature, right? The team, everyone on the team knows if this thing fails, we all fail. So there's a little bit more intimacy with the market, so to speak, and with any other external factors that will determine your success or demise. And I've worked in both, and I think that in larger companies, I won't name names, but large company I have worked with and in tends to attract really ambitious people, hires explicitly really smart, ambitious people, and oftentimes straight out of school. A lot of them straight out of school. And when you have a young person who is smart and ambitious, who has spent their whole career sort of like climbing the ladder of getting into this or that program and getting the good grades, the next logical step for them in that framework is, okay, I want to get promoted, which, okay, great. That's fine. But it's really difficult for a large company to create a promotion process that has incentives that line up with product success. It sounds like it should be straightforward, but in reality, it's quite difficult. There's a lot of sort of, you're almost, you end up in a situation where you're optimizing for the test, so to speak, as opposed to the learning and the outcome. And this is, I think the French have a work to order strike kind of concept
Oh, seeing
where,
like
it's, I think it's interesting, like I say, that's right, where they're, the idea is you don't stop working, you just work 110% by the book. And if you do that, everything falls apart. Because the book cannot account for all the complexities and idiosyncrasies of real life and the real process of a work environment. Even if it's a factory, they can't do it. And so there's a little bit of that process that happens in any large company, I think. And it's quite difficult to overcome. My own experience with it was rather intimate because early on in developing world scale AR in a mapping application that you may know or use, we were pretty gung ho on this is the right path forward. But my research, I was lead researcher on this project, and we were relatively small early on. I think that we started with like 3 or 4 people, grew quite a bit later, but at first it was a relatively small project. And what I saw in my research was pretty legitimate safety issues. When you're talking about world scale augmented reality, I mentioned earlier, the environment is quite dangerous, so to speak. It's a city with cars and fast moving objects around you. But there's also the sort of cognitive effect of looking at the world through a screen. And there are a few things that happen there. One is, your vision is restricted. You're looking at a phone in front of you, not the real world, which means your peripheral vision is gone. Like that's just kind of that's the nature of human vision, is once you're looking at something right in front, peripheral vision totally shot. You also, what you are looking at, if you're looking at augmented reality, and this was augmented reality walking navigation, by the way, just to be clear. So objects in the world, 3D position to show you which way you should start walking, which has real value for a number of people in a number of contexts. And I can talk about that too. But up front, this was sort of one of the first challenges. And so you're looking at the world, you've lost peripheral vision. What you are looking at is, of course, not the actual resolution of the world. It's the resolution of the world through your camera, so you might not notice important details. You're also looking at a floating 3D object, which is deeply entrancing in many ways. And one of the challenges we had was actually making those look less interesting. Because we would do studies, and I would have people receive a notification at the top of their phone while they were using it. And even within, the 3x5 inch screen that they were holding, they didn't notice the notification because they were so entranced by that floating 3D object. So an overall reduction in situation awareness, made worse by the fact that people were not cognizant of that reduction. Because on paper, at least, I'm looking up, I'm seeing what's in front of me. How could I be less aware? And so there was a sort of sense of overconfidence and reduced situation awareness. That's a pretty bad combination. And so I was relatively new to the scene at that company. Didn't know what I was doing in a lot of ways, to be honest. But I started sounding the alarms because we have a big problem. And there were people whose careers, promotions, sense of importance were put at risk by me sounding those alarms.
In what ways?
So Google has a history. I said the company. There's a history of killing things, right?
Search engine that we all use.
Yeah.
It's quite handy.
Market, yeah.
Right. So there's a history of killing things, right? Of products that, get some investment for a few years and then, this isn't working, cut. And some of the people on the team had that experience. They had been working on things that they had spent a year, 2 years, 3 years on. They got cut and it never saw the light of day. And people were, there's a jumpiness around that and anxiety, I think, that sort of generated. And the fear was, if Kasey got his way here, maybe this whole thing is dead in the water and all this work is for nothing. Totally legitimate concern on a sort of at least basic self-interested level. And we're all self-interested. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. And so that was sort of the reaction. And on my part, I was not particularly savvy on how to handle those concerns, nor was I particularly aware of them to begin with, because I was pretty fresh.
I just want to chime in real quick, because that's like so fascinating. Like what you're describing basically is it's a known thing inside the organization, a reputation that is also very well known outside. So it's almost like there's a consensus, both from the observers external to the org and inside the org, that there's this weird readiness, hair trigger readiness to kill a product if it looks like it has sufficient obstacles in its way to hitting escape velocity. Mm-hmm. And what you were dealing with was not even that force of gravity. You were dealing with the reaction to that force of gravity, which is basically dealing with like people saying, I don't want this bad thing that typically happens to a lot of products inside of our organization to happen. And so in a sense, like you're bringing up this very legitimate concerning point, and it's being interpreted as, oh no, here comes the specter. Like there's going to be another tombstone in the graveyard of products.
Is that where your researcher becomes therapist?
Yeah. Like how did you balance that? How did you get that through the finish line?
This was well before I understood that researcher and therapist is kind of the same thing. So at first I made a lot of people very mad because I was just, no, we can't do it. I didn't have an answer, right? I didn't have a solution to the problem. It just seemed like this is going to go out to 1 billion people. That product has 1 billion users. I mean, the scale is rather enormous. Right. And so I was quite concerned about what the ramifications of that could be at scale, and kind of freaked out, to be honest. I didn't make many friends at that point, until I began to realize that I needed to kind of work with the system as it was a little bit more. And acknowledge that there's incentive structures around me that I have to navigate, and part of that was just bringing people out into the field with me. That was step one. Was okay. Everyone needs to come see what I'm seeing firsthand. It's not enough for me to just come and squawk about it. I need you to come see it yourself, and that started to kind of soften the resistance at first. And then there was also a little bit of the carrot side of things, which was to turn it into sort of a positive spin, not to saying, hey, like, I know this is a challenge, but we're such a great team, you're such a great designer, I know that we can design a solution here. Trying to turn it into more of a design opportunity as opposed to just a roadblock. And ultimately also, doing a lot, earning the runway to do the research to solve the problem legitimately. So I was doing all sorts of insane kind of research, putting what's called detection response task systems, which is usually in a human factors laboratory. So for driving technology, for example, if you have like a new dashboard app on a car, they'll put a user in a simulator. They'll put this DRT rig on them, which is either it will either be a light that's kind of in your peripheral vision up here that emits light every few 6 to 8 seconds at random intervals, or it'll be a vibrating tactor that will be taped to your clavicle. And that's the kind I used. And the idea is that tactor will vibrate at a random interval, but roughly every 5 to 10 seconds, let's say. And the participant who has a primary task, which is use this interface, drive whatever the primary task might be, they now have a secondary task, which is to, as soon as you feel that vibration, click this button, which will be strapped to their finger, quite literally. And I want you to click it every time you feel it, and I want you to click it as soon as you feel it. And we collect the data from all of that. And what that does is it effectively allows us to quantify their cognitive capacity. So the more demanding the primary task is of whatever they're doing, the slower they're going to respond to that vibration, and the less accurate they'll be with responding to every single one, which gives us a way to sort of quantify situation awareness. Now, what I did is I took that whole system and I put it in a backpack, I put it on my participants, and I put them out into the field, doing that while using different experiences, both the existing navigation experience as well as the AR experience. And by doing that, I was actually able to quantify the delta in situation awareness of participants between those two variants, and show to leadership, who I couldn't bring out into the field with me, but I could show them something solid and quantitative that, hey, we do have an issue here, and we need to solve it. And so that was a big step as well. And then once I had done all that, it was getting the team on board to the degree that safety became sort of a rallying cry for us. Yes, we're solving the needs of a particular set of users. So we need to all be on board and sort of invested in those users, which tends to be people with low navigational ability, people who tend to struggle with directional orientation in cities and things like that. And we could talk about that as well. But building user empathy with the team, it's a lot of us, especially in a new city, right?
I would also imagine that Tesla failed that test with their 40,000 inch screen inside the car.
Oh, you think so? I don't know. Yeah, that's
I mean,
would,
bring
I put money on that.
Bring haptic stuff back. Yeah, I want my knobs.
Wow. Yes. Yeah, I totally agree, Harrison. There's no way it passed those tests. But anyway, yeah. So getting that, you did. But getting the team on board, and also developing a solution that ultimately did work. So the product that was shipped literally doesn't let you walk forward in AR. It will shut down the screen if it senses forward motion. That ended up being our solution, and we were able to prove that it solved the problem. And so today, I mean, that was released, oh my gosh, 5 years ago, maybe now? That can't be right. Maybe 4. And to date, there's been no reports of any sort of injury that any of us are aware of. So it was deemed successful, I think. But it took a lot of work.
And you were able to build empathy. You were able to build empathy with the people that originally came into that room that you were asking, what do we know and what do we not know? And then when they came back from the field work that they were a part of, tell me about their reaction. Tell me about like the questions
I think early on
that they were displaying afterwards. Yeah.
It's a good question. I think there was a sort of realization that, okay, we do have an issue here. And also not just seeing study participants in the field, but also using it themselves and realizing, I'm actually not so aware of my surroundings. So there's, a sort of embodied element to the empathy as well, just being in that position and using it themselves. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, well, actually, okay. I want to. This is like super fascinating because there's like it's like almost like there's like glimmers into like scenes in this story of the augmented reality feature coming together. I've heard bits of the story itself though in the many hangouts that we've had, Kasey, and like I think that it is such a crazy like just thing that came together. Can you tell the story of how it was that Google Maps' augmented reality feature went from being an idea to rolling out to 1 billion people?
Yeah, I can. So it goes back to Street View, actually, which was one of the very first things that Google did as early days. Started taking pictures of streets. And there wasn't really a huge justification for that at the time. It just seemed like, hey, this could be useful. We have the scale to do it. Wouldn't it be neat? And, there was value in Street View. After that, people could go, walk around the world, so to speak, in these virtual environments. And that was really cool. But it wasn't until machine learning and a few other technologies became advanced enough that we could take the image from your device. So if you're holding up your phone camera and you're pointing it at a building, the technological hurdle to get to realistically and accurately placed 3D objects in the world is simply knowing with hyper precision where is your phone in the first place. And as you know, especially in cities, the environments where we're designing for, the GPS could be blocks off. It could be turned the totally wrong direction. Could be very, very inaccurate. So you can't rely on that. That's dead in the water. But what you can do is what's now called visual positioning system. So instead of geographic GPS, it's now visual positioning system, VPS. The camera's looking at a building, and it's able to cross-reference Street View imagery within, at that point you can use GPS to, narrow the possibilities of where you might be, grab the Street View imagery from a given radius in the area, cross-reference that, and identify some of the salient elements within that image. So maybe it's a cornice on a building or a particular window, some salient kind of unique object within that scene, identify, oh, hey, that matches the Street View imagery. And if it does, that Street View imagery has metadata. And some of that metadata is geographic positioning information, latitude, longitude, and all sorts of hyper high precision geographic information, which can then be sent back to say, okay, well, if we have that data with that image and we're we're now looking at that same object, those same salient details from maybe a slightly different perspective, because we're on the sidewalk, we're not in the middle of the street, we're somewhere else, we're at a different angle. We can actually do the math, and not we, I mean, these are the engineers, of course, who are doing stuff way smarter than I could imagine doing, to do the math to kind of untangle that mess and say, okay, given all of that data, given all the mathematics that we've run, given the machine learning, this is where your phone is in the world with super high precision. And once you have that, now you can start to place 3D objects accurately in the world around you.
Who had this insight? Because that's like such a stack of like uncoveries to compile.
No.
And was this before dot projection? And is this like Xbox Kinect's technology? I think Apple bought that dot projection technology. Was this the reason why? Yeah, go on.
Well, I don't know much about that. I will say it had nothing to do with like LiDAR or anything like that. Okay. It wasn't dependent on that kind of hardware. Because LiDAR, I think, at least on an iPhone, for example, is only good for a certain distance. It can't do like a larger environment. Yeah. I mean, that will, if that gets better, that will be another opportunity to improve the accuracy of three-dimensional objects in AR.
But what was the light bulb spark moment? Like, because that's a whole bunch of stuff you just described. Like, when was you said you were there when it was 3 to 4 people like on the team on?
Well, 3 to 4. So I should clarify. There was the engineering team who had been working on the underlying technology, sort of in a research capacity, for a very long time. I was on the UX team that said, okay, if we have these opportunities, how can we apply it? Much more on the application side. And I think this is actually a really important point for startups in general, which is startups don't build technology. Technology is built differently. It's built in a research setting, and that is available to Google because Google has, incredible amounts of funding, patient capital, maybe less so than it used to, but that capital allows for really long runways of experimentation. Things like this, these sort of underlying combinatorial, if we use Brian Arthur's kind of concept of the combinatorial evolution of technology, experimentation. And in that environment, by the way, that, throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, kind of the naive scientific method, that actually works. You can do that just fine. And you can find, new hills to climb, so to speak, by doing that. And in fact, this is exactly how, for example, we got solar cells. So if you go back to the 1950s, I believe it was, Bell Labs developed the solar cell. Incredible invention. Nobody wanted it because it was so expensive and the energy output from it was so minimal. There was absolutely no application anywhere in the world for solar cells. It was just sort of like, gee whiz, neat, that's cool. Okay, you can turn the sun into a tiny little bit of energy for the cost of a mansion. Great. Well, it wasn't until the 1960s when we started to need some form of renewable energy for satellites in space that suddenly there was an application for that. But that was developed in a corporate laboratory, not in a startup, right? So startups don't build technology, startups apply technology. So I was effectively within the Google universe. I just lost my headphones. Excuse me one second. I'm back. Within the Google universe, I was on the startup side. Yes, my gesticulations have gotten the best of me. I was on the startup side, not the technology side. We were looking for applications of that technology, which at the time felt very backwards, right? It felt like, wait a second, we're sort of a hammer looking for a nail, which isn't necessarily ideal in that setting, but we were able to sort of do the foundational research up front in addition to the iteration on the technology itself to find a good product market fit for that particular feature. For probably a smaller market segment than the company would have liked. It's not a huge feature. It's not like everyone's using it all the time. But for the people who need it, it's incredibly valuable. And I ended up working with people who have Alzheimer's and autism and other cognitive disabilities for whom reading a map, a 3D abstracted version of their environment is really difficult. And by turning it into a concrete, what's called an egocentric representation of space rather than allocentric representation of space, which is top down and abstracted, they're not only able to navigate, they're able to have real independence in the city that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And we ended up doing quite a bit of work with some from researchers who were in that space and neuroscientists that focus on that kind of thing to make sure that we were meeting those needs as well. And that ended up being, for me at least, kind of a huge motivation for designing the thing to begin with, was meeting the needs of people who struggled otherwise.
How did you get buy-in along the way if the feature wasn't going to be used by a lot of people? I mean, call me crazy, but corporations typically focus on like profit driven, lots of mass adoption. How did you get buy-in into a feature, that's just not getting used a lot? And then who was it that was being leaned on by you to almost like shepherd everything through? Was it the employees? Was it like these outside consultants that you also brought in? Like, tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I think there was a sense that, walking navigation for a relatively small but motivated market was sort of the tip of the spear, right? Or the toehold of value, as I like to say. The most motivated people for whom we could provide value up front.
Whoa.
Whether or not that was a large market, not actually that important. The point is, it was a starting point. The technology can do a lot more than just walking navigation, but we needed to begin to prove it out. Now, since that time, since I left Google, I believe a lot of this technology has been made available via API for other developers to build on top of. And that's really exciting because there's certain things that Google can do that are, Google is a relatively unopinionated kind of company when it's developing products. It doesn't want to take a too hard of a stance because it's serving billions of people. That's fine, but it limits what can be done in other niches with the given technology. So the more that we create an ecosystem for developers of these tools, a lot more value can be generated, both for Google and those developers. And I think that's that platform approach is really important. So there was a sense that would be, I think, a long distance goal, but our goal immediately was to provide that toehold of value up front. And I think we pulled that off.
That's very interesting. So it's not necessarily like a lot of users that you anticipated using this so much as it was, that if we get this right, there's a group of users that will 100% adopt this. I think that is so interesting from like a strategy point of view. When, you think about like all the accessibility features that like a watch has, or your iPhone, or like a lot of phones today have. And I remember when some of those features first came out, I said to myself, like, if I was deaf, I would immediately cling on to this. But because I'm not deaf, I don't have empathy for it. I mean, I have as much empathy as my imagination will allow me to. But
sure,
that is fascinating. That like, and it's also reassuring that larger companies are still thinking about that in that way.
Yeah, I think, and I shouldn't, I don't want to revise the history too much. There was definitely a desire for a larger market along the way. But I think by, at least for us as designers, focusing on that high need group, it just focused us in general, which I think when you're designing is so important. But in city planning and urban design, we have this concept of the curb cut effect. And the curb cut effect is effectively when the American Disabilities Act, ADA, was passed, it required that sidewalks have a curb cut for people in wheelchairs. That was a very targeted move for people with legitimate physical disabilities. However, what we realized after the fact was that it made life better for everybody. It made life better for people with strollers, people with luggage, just less tripping on the sidewalk curb in general. And so I think that by focusing on really high needs groups, it's often the case that you end up improving life for a much broader group of people. And I think that was the case with augmented reality walking navigation as well. It's called Live
Here's
View,
here's a,
by the way.
here's a weird
So,
example of this that I experienced this past weekend. So, do you guys know the word game Bananagrams? It's like tiles,
I don't.
letters, they come in a little Ziploc banana, and you
Oh
like pour
yeah.
them out.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think I've seen
So
this, but I don't know.
yeah, you've seen this, right? And so like my girlfriend and I and her family, we all really love word games. And so we've been playing Snatch a lot. And it's a game where you basically flip over the tiles and you try to see if you can make words from the tiles that are open in the sort of arena section, as well as other people's individual words. Look it up, Snatch. It's a Bananagrams variant, but the tiles are really small, right?
Hmm.
And um, people as they get older tend to get farsighted actually, and they have a harder time
Yeah.
seeing, even if the letters are like, the closer they get to them, sometimes it can be hard. Like, you've seen this with
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
older folks that maybe have to like pull out a phone away from them to be able to read the
Hmm.
text, or they have to like increase the size of the font. So when we were on a vacation this past week, they brought out bananagrams, and the tiles were bigger, like way bigger than the normal Bananagram.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there was like 8 of us playing, and so we were actually also spread out. And suddenly, like, I realized, I was like, this is so much more pleasant than the regular Bananagrams tiles, almost to the point where like Bananagrams messed up by making the unaccessible version the default. And like, in trying to serve this one very specific need of like people with impaired eyesight, they made the curb cut effect way
Yeah.
easier to read. And actually, like, we could play a game with more people because there was more space occupied, and you could see the
Yeah.
tiles from far away.
I have a similar story.
Oh, really?
It's with my good friend Marley. She is already like a savant at this one game called oh my god, why did I just forget it? It's when you lay out all the numbers, not Scrabble. It's anyway, you lay out all these numbers and you have to like basically come up with different ways to align them. We got a bigger set.
Is it Sudoku?
No, not Sudoku.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll take too much time thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
it. But
sure.
anyway, and if she's listening to this, she's going to kill me if like
Yeah.
I don't remember. I'll remember it right after the episode, I guarantee it. But
Of course.
we got bigger pieces, and all of a sudden, she was already running laps around me, and now she's just doing it in like 2x, just because like the puzzle pieces were bigger.
Right, and it's just easier to parse that's a 9, right? Or
And then this other story comes to mind where there was this book that I was reading where this steel company was experiencing like a lot of safety risk because the molten lava was spilling out of the molds and like burning parts of people's arms. And so this new CEO comes in, and profits are not looking good. Like performance quarter over quarter is not looking very good, and of course you have the safety issue. Well, this new CEO comes in, and he's like, okay, bottom up safety overhaul, and press fast forward, the entire factory becomes way safer. And because everyone is so regimented and so thoughtful, the byproduct is it spills out into all these other parts of the organization.
right.
And like that just gives me goosebumps because it shows that if you start with one thing with maniacal focus, there are just these unknown unknowns that turn out to be really, really good. So it started with the wheelchair, which was the right thing to do. And now it's benefiting mothers with strollers, people with like luggage. Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
Yeah,
although
right.
they shouldn't be on the sidewalk.
Well, but if you're gonna mount your city bike,
Yeah, that's
you
true.
gotta
Yeah.
how else you get on there?
There you
Yeah. So okay, I have a slight direction adjustment
go. Let's do it.
that it's a bit of an indulgence for me. I've wanted you two to be in the same room when this conversation comes up for like over a year now.
Wow.
It's happening.
Kasey brought something up about a year ago when we were hanging out that the first thought that crossed my mind was, where is Harrison for this conversation? Kasey said to me, and I don't know if you remember this, Kasey, but you said something to the effect of, it is an utter societal failure that we don't appreciate the immense power that designers are given, and we don't interrogate that more than we currently do. And that like actually so much of what happened in the 20th century was essentially designers exercising unchecked power um, which was, I was like, whoa, I had never heard, a historical narrative of like design power. But like, can you first of all, did I characterize this correctly? Like, do you remember this?
Yeah. It sounds like one of my rants. Yeah. So it's a hard history to parse because I don't think we're necessarily in that position today, depending on who you call a designer. Most design doesn't happen by designers now. Most design is effectively, maybe it's the bidding of product owners, so to speak, who are focused on making sure that bottom lines are met, or if you want to go a layer of abstraction higher, it's designed by capital and capital returns, which isn't necessarily different than it's always been, just a slightly different structure for getting there. So yeah, era of high modernism, very a lot of hubris in design at that point in time, right? And I think by the 19 and you can talk about Brasilia in the city planning world. Of course, this is one of the most pronounced sort of failures. I'm originally from St. Louis, and the story of Pruitt-Igoe, it's a public housing project that sort of symbolizes its demolition. Eventually, sort of symbolizes the end of modernism, like the failure of high modernism. The real story is a bit more complex than that, but that's not entirely wrong. But there was a lot of hubris on the part of designers to reimagine the world as a blank slate, sort of tabula rasa, and we can impart our visions of perfect geometric efficiency on that new blank slate, without any respect for what might have been there before or what's working, any of the sort of ecological complexity at a social or environmental level that may be there. We can forget about that. And so designers fundamentally had both complete control, and they believed they had complete knowledge, and they acted accordingly. Then there was sort of a reckoning in the city planning world. This is the story of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses that I think a lot of people know. And things shifted a lot. They went from this idea of superhero designer who is given complete power to the designer still has control, whether or not they're called a designer, they still have control, but we're going to do user studies, and we're going to, listen to our users and design around them. And this became...
Can you give some year markers for this? Like, when is it that the designers embark to do this tabula rasa reimagining of the world? And then, for those who are not urban planning, geeks, the Jane Jacobs, Robert Moses kind of era.
Yeah, so that was, mid-century was high modernism, 1940s, 50s, 60s. By the 1980s, we've turned a corner. And in city planning, that means a devolution of power to the community. And I should give some air quotes to the community, because this is how we got NIMBYism in city planning as well, is there was no longer really an adult in the room, and all power was given to homeowners who could manipulate the zoning process and permit process to make sure that they hold the value that's being generated by their community entirely. There's a black pill version of the Jane Jacobs story in all of this, if you're into the city planning stuff. But the term user-centered design comes around in the 1980s. And it turns things on its head to say, okay, as designers, we're going to maintain control, but we're going to study people and their behavior, and we're going to design accordingly. So like this sort of archetypical example is, we're not going to have any paths in the university quad. We're going to watch how people walk and leave paths in the snow during the winter. And university then that's where we're going to, really? Right? So,
yeah.
And that's where we're going to we're going to pave, right? So we're paving, paving these paths based on user behavior, making things easier. And this is also, I think, this shift towards making things easier is also a bit about how design lost its ambition, and designers who had big, bold ambitions in the era of high modernism are now like, yeah, how do we make it delightful? How do we make it easy to use? Like, the ambition level just dropped dramatically in this.
One example that comes to mind is like when brutalism was like introduced 80s ish, right? And it wasn't a consolidation of power for architects so much as it was cost constraints on materials. And that's why everyone just went to like rocks and concrete. And then suddenly like the Lincoln Center, like, a couple decades later is something to like be marveled at because it's beautiful. But for like those first couple decades, it was super ugly and no one really liked it, but it was way under budget and it did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was house something in a low cost way.
Right.
Or even like when iOS 7 came out, there was a departure from skeuomorphism, and there was no bridge between skeuomorphism and flat design. And what ended up happening was a lot of our parents got left out. They couldn't make, they had gone like 7 versions and they couldn't cross the chasm into a more minimal interface that can do more, that was associated with planes that you maybe had to have like a cognitive understanding of. But if you could not make that leap, then you were kind of left for the next like 3 or 4 versions figuring it out. And anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but those are 2 examples that kind of came to mind where I was like,
that's interesting. I hadn't made that connection before. So I think there's a so Mitchell Resnick has this idea of low floors, high ceilings, as the ideal mode for human creation in some sense. And the idea is low floors being, okay, it's really easy to get started. And I think this is where designers got focused, is how do we make this so easy to use that anyone can do it? I think there was a bit of a loss of the idea of high ceilings. How do we empower people to move beyond what they can currently do using technology and tools? And so this is where this idea that I'm a bit obsessed with, I call it design for emergence. You can call it whatever you'd like. It's not like a new idea. It's the idea that not only are we going to assume that users know what they need, or at least have the relevant knowledge for design to take place, because they don't always know what they need, but they have the relevant knowledge. We're also going to give them the necessary tools to adapt a design to their needs. We're going to give them a language and a generative grammar along with this alphabet that we provide. So more of like a Lego bricks type process. And this to me is like actually a step beyond user-centered design. User-centered design is fantastic when you have a lot of people with a single similar need. So, the design, we know how to design chairs because everyone needs to sit. We don't really need a whole lot of composability in the development of a chair because everyone sits more or less the same way. But that user-centered approach ends up designing for the median person. It doesn't design for everybody. There's sort of a long tail of user needs that don't get met because to meet them costs just as much as meeting the needs that are, at least in a user-centered design paradigm, it costs just as much to develop that product or tool as it does the need that everyone has. So for example, with Google Maps, everyone needs to get from A to B. We should solve that problem. We should dump a bunch of money into solving that problem. How to get from A to B is not the same number of users. We talked about earlier, how many users is this in fact, as say like, when is this coast at high tide? To somebody, that might be extremely important information, but not to a lot of people. So no one's going to build that. The idea behind this sort of emergent design process is that you capture a wider array of problems user needs by giving a composable solution that people can adapt themselves And then it starts to make sense from a market perspective because you're getting that sort of horizontal span as opposed to the vertical of those needs that people can adapt to their own solutions, applying their own knowledge. And so the idea here is, rather than the designer maintaining control, they're going to let go of control to people and really empower them with tools. Now, it's really hard to pull off in practice. Like there's really interesting examples of this in what's called end user programming, which digital spreadsheets are kind of an archetypical example of. HyperCard in the 1980s by Apple was a really classic example. This sort of card-based interface that could be conjoined and built into, it was used, kids use it to do games, scientists use it for research. I believe it was in Kuala Lumpur, the building lights were based on it. It's super composable, used for all sorts of things, but they killed it because they couldn't figure out how to make money on it. Well, we now have SaaS products and SaaS business models, and that totally changes the dynamic of these kinds of tools. And so now you start to see a new generation of these kinds of tools, things that aren't necessarily entirely, the ideal, but are clearly motioning in that direction. Things like Notion, or there's a tool called ClickUp that's really composable for different solutions, or Zapier, or Airtable. All these tools that, you can, if you know how to use them, and they're relatively easy to use, that's really important. A person who doesn't know how to programming code, of course, is incredibly composable, but it's not very user-friendly. But the idea is that you create some abstractions that people can compose their own solutions with. And I think that's kind of where, in a lot of ways, important elements of design are moving right now, is towards this idea that as a designer, I build something that I can then be surprised by. In the way that the user then turns around and creates something else with it for themselves.
There's also a tension. This is one of the things that's so fascinating to me, like sort of having just been watching things unfold on like internet native products for the last decade, is that there's a tension between that designing for emergence and this very natural sort of like bureaucratic grubbiness that the typical sort of digital product has, that wants to be the journal of record for whatever data it is that it's processing, because it knows that if be that journal of record for you, you'll never be able to replace it.
Yeah.
But designing for emergence, I think one of the principles, at least from like the essay that you wrote about this, that I really love, we'll definitely link that in the description for this video on YouTube. It like one of the natural ways that you design for emergence is that like a digital product actually emits its data exhaust as it's getting generated, so that like, Zapier is the example you brought up that I actually think might even deserve to be elevated into a bit of a category of its own, because it allows for the composability of this data exhaust. So for example, like picked our transcription tool because it had a Zapier integration where its competitors didn't. Shout out Fireflies for building a Zapier integration. And like, frankly, all due respect, anyone else who we evaluated that got significant funding, not like two guys in a garage phase. What are you doing? Like, to be able to like know that I created some data on this platform, let it be the journal of record. It can, sure, like whatever, we'll see how useful you are. But to be able to know that that can get emitted, and now we can pipe that into some other journal of record or some other system, do stuff with the data, like completely changes the game in terms of like how much power and functionality gets unlocked. But I think that the tension is sometimes to the loss of the product that wants to be the ledger for all the stuff happening.
I mean, I almost think of one example that comes to mind is like, even before Notion, before Zapier, all these different levels that are today, I almost think of like the drop-down menu to select your font for the very first time. Like that was game changing. Like Papyrus, Comic Sans aside, you had the ability to control different inputs versus just a Times New Roman, right? And kind of, I just want to go back a little to like the power that designers have, and like two examples come to mind. The first example is, and I just love to hear your knee-jerk reactions to this. The first example is like, we now know that a certain shade of blue converts higher than all other shades of blue. And we now understand how color theory can manipulate or direct in a flow at a flow's will, right? The second example that comes to mind is whenever you're on a site, typically you'll see this on fashion sites. And I this is like a whole nother can of worms that I'd love to dive into with you. But typically on fashion sites, you'll arrive at the site, and as soon as you start to scroll, they think that you're uninterested. So a pop-up comes up and it's like, would you like to save 10%? And it's like, enter email. Yes, I'd love to save 10%. And then at the bottom, it's almost like it was designed by a PM and then hard coded. It just says, no, I don't want to save 10%. I want to spend full price. And it's like, why on earth would you, like, I can't imagine a designer doing that, because naturally the discipline just like has ethics. But those were just two examples that came to mind where I was like, wow, that's a really dark UI pattern. And if a designer did do that, that's a lot of power, because you're not only like manipulating someone, you are also guilting them.
Yeah, it's like,
that's severe.
It's like, I am ashamed of myself, right?
Yeah, it's like, right. I don't want to click it, but you don't have an X.
Yeah. I don't know if I think this is a matter of there's user-centered design, because it's retaining that power in an environment where, venture capital wants its returns, or, the shareholders, whoever they are, want their returns, lends itself towards those kinds of outcomes. Which I don't mean to say that like that's a particularly egregious example. So I don't want to say like it's all evil. It's not. A lot of designers are doing really good work in a user-centered paradigm, but in an environment where you're focused on empowering the user by giving them creation tools in some sense, some degree of composability for solving their own needs. I think that's a totally different framework. And to your point, agree, there's clear desires for companies to hold on to their little data moats and make sure that interoperability is not available, which is sort of like the ultimate composabilities. When you have interoperability and composability across tools, that's when things become really powerful and you get these workflows that are incredible. There's a need to maintain that data in large part for economic reasons. However, I'd like for us to get to a state where we're competing not on who's holding their data the most tightly, but rather who's offering the best experience for the user, who's empowering the user the most. And I think there's ways in which we might be moving towards that world. And Zapier is a good example of maybe a nudge in that direction, where, we're no longer competing on data moats, but rather actual value provided to the user. And that's part of my motivation for trying to push things in that direction in the little ways that I have available to me.
Wow. Yeah. That's super heady. So you're basically just saying like, it's not a data game. It's actually just like, it goes back to the core, which is like, data means diddly squat, unless you can actually have like a great UI, you can have a great experience with it. When you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is you have companies like Jasper AI, and I think I talked about this a little on like the Brian Landers podcast, but you have like let me start over. You have OpenAI, right? Underlying technology now to all these, GIF wrapped, different specialized, it doesn't matter nowadays if you're leveraging that technology so much as it does how do you actually engage with it. And so when you look at a company like Jasper AI, they've been in the game well before OpenAI was released, and they've gotten really, really good at understanding their audience, which is just marketers, or like content writers. And so if you wanted to get the same results from Jasper, from OpenAI, like, ChatGPT, you'd have to first become what Jasper already is, which is
Right.
a master prompt writer for exactly your role. And so I think like that's just one example that comes to mind. But yeah, are there any examples that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, the AI shift, this totally bonkers moment that we're in, definitely changes the dynamic of the value of data, because it can be extrapolated on exactly like that. Which I think is in some ways going to be a push in the other direction, right? It's like, oh damn, data is now super valuable. We got to clamp down on our data and make sure no one else is able to scrape it. So I'm a little worried about what the state of the open web is going to end up being in the years to come, as everything ends up being kind of given to the mulcher. The other aspect of this, though, is the AI mulcher. It's a generous mulcher in some ways.
Well, the irony of that, Casey, also is that the leading vector database, shout out Pinecone, it's called Pinecone DB, and a lot of mulch is made from
That's
evergreen
right.
trees, right?
They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But the quality, the issue here is that the quality of tools diminishes over time when the product owner knows that they have your data and they're not going to let go of it. It's exactly what happens with monopolies in general. Is they no longer have to compete because they own the data, and the tools end up being a worse experience because of it. And we're seeing this across all sorts of products right now, where the experience is actually getting worse, not better.
Right.
And it tends to be the companies who have a lot of data, and don't have to compete on experience.
I want to posit another sort of like heady counter narrative of what the future could be.
Please.
Which is founded on the belief of the market as a force for justice, which I think anybody who knows me knows that I believe that in the marrow of my bones, which is why also, if you look back at like at least my personal track record or like my career, just doing whatever I thought was the most interesting thing to be doing at any given time, it was usually building something like a marketplace. So
Sure.
like
These are facts.
Yeah. And I think that like what you're saying, Casey, is 100% true, which is that data monopolies, strictly speaking, are able to extract much more value, right, than sort of data free markets, perfectly competitive. Everybody has a transcription tool. They all have the same like Zapier emissions, right? And yet, I can't help but feel like kind of the same way what the internet did to open source software, which is that it set in motion this like 30 plus year long journey that we are now like in the inflection point, I would say, of that S curve, that open source software almost is in that territory where it's just default ripping ahead of closed source solutions. And a lot of that has to do with the collaboration created, like enabled by the internet. Could it not be the case that ultimately, even though the data fortresses like LinkedIn, because LinkedIn had a data fortress before Twitter and Facebook had really set up their modes. LinkedIn, it was like, dude, it was actually like shout out James C. Scott, shout out Against the Grain, where he talks about like how city walls were originally developed to keep people in the cities because they were desperately trying to get out, right? Is the same thing happening with SaaS products and their data, which is that OAuth barriers, right, that are like log in with Google and like API, what API? Like, like that type of thing is actually a kind of like digital city wall trying to trap the data in. Like LinkedIn had a data fortress from the jump, and they made it so easy, and actually they made it hard for you to keep your data from getting in. Like if you wanted to keep your contacts list on your email from getting into LinkedIn, it was like, do you remember the blog posts on this from like 2016 that would float around on the design Facebook groups of like people would do audits of like how many steps were involved to break the dark UI flow or the dark UX flow of LinkedIn accidentally like ransacking your Gmail contacts.
Oh.
Yeah.
Whoa.
It was like a 30-step process that you would have to like X out, cancel, discontinue, stop,
Well,
like
this sounds like Adobe subscription cancellation.
yeah,
You
yeah,
have to
yeah,
call in to a
Oh
number that
man.
you're not even sure if they're going to pick up. You
exactly.
have
Yeah.
no idea you're in a black hole.
And so yeah, like LinkedIn now, it's like even to this day when you go to the LinkedIn website, like you're just like fucking linkedin.com and it'll be like holding just a moment, confirming that you're actually a human being, not a scumbag scraping robot. And you're like, okay, that's kind of aggressive. And it's like, hey, let's check in on that. Can you breathe into the microphone? And you're like, why do I need to do this to access, like, I just want to update my work history. And like everywhere, like Twitter now is going in this direction, Reddit is going in this direction.
Well, I think
Yeah.
if you look at like Elon Musk talk about bringing the advent of electric cars to the 21st century, he gives away all these patents,
Right.
but really everyone at the core of that company knows that they are miles ahead when it comes to
100%.
training data around self-driving, and all these other
Right.
car manufacturers are going to be left in the dust. And so when an antitrust hits that company, which it eventually will, it maybe won't be as severe. Or even today's insurance companies, like I always opt out of this when they ask, because it's just like it's a total red flag. They're like, hey, why don't you just we'll send you a little device for free, and then we'll get to track your driving.
Oh yeah, or
And we'll get
how
to
much you press your brakes and stuff.
but what
Yeah.
consumers really don't know is like that data is shared between insurance companies. So it's in their self-interest to get you tracked so that they can either lower or increase the cost, but they're banking on the fact that they will increase your cost no matter what, because you're going to have a hard break that one day, or it's going to be rainy and you chose to drive over the speed limit a bit. It's like that's destructive. They don't have to do anything except for like collect profits.
Yeah, so I mean, I apologize for that, like on my side, like meandering sort of thesis statement, but
No, I
like
love
the
it.
market a force of justice, like makes it so that I think in the long run, everybody's going to have a Zapier integration if they're collecting any customer data, because the customer's just going to be like, what do you mean you're holding my data hostage? What do you mean that, you don't support webhooks? Like, because they're going to want to use it for AI applications. They're going to want to use it to compose stuff. I don't know. Like, what do you guys think?
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
So this reminds me actually of a take I heard recently. It's not my own take, but that if the market is the forest that we're looking at, this ecosystem, there's sort of there's the underground network of mycelium, right? And there's sort of like the internet of the forest that's happening below the surface. Developers, engineers have a slightly different incentive than the companies they work for, because they're not going to be there forever. They're going to go to other companies. And the most annoying thing to an engineer is to build some sort of tooling and then lose access to their own tools the moment they go to another company. And the take I heard somewhere on Twitter, I think, was like, this is what drives open source software. It's engineers handing their own tools to themselves when they go to their next job. And I don't know if, that's maybe an oversimplified, version of the story, but I love it because it kind of is indicative of this this rich underbelly of the whole thing, with real people, with real incentives and real sort of relationships across time and space. And it made me kind of hopeful, actually, that there's this sort of rogue undercurrent. This story of open source is much longer and more complex than that, but even in environments where all the other incentives point towards closing things down, there's this really basic desire to have access to tools, to borrow Stuart Brand's slogan. And so I think, things like that will continue to be the case no matter what.
And it's interesting what you're talking about with design for emergence, is that it almost feels like grain aligned with with the idea of more things being more open sourced, right? Increasing the openness of, like, with open source, that's happening right now. We're seeing it happen almost by default. A lot of like software first and software only companies are just like, we're going to be the open source version of this like well-defined category, right? And that's working really well, I think, in part because of what you're saying, Kasey, which is like, I'm thinking like Dan Abramov, right? Like leaving, I think he left Facebook. This like huge React influencer who was on the React core team, left Facebook and is now working at Blue Sky. And part of why he chose Blue Sky is that their app is built in React Native. And so he's able to continue contributing to this project he's been working on for so long, just in a new environment or a new workplace. It feels like that design for emergence that you're talking about, things that we can do with data, Lego blockifying that data, is almost like what happens when not just the software layer is now more open, but the data layer is now also more open. And like there's still, I think, open questions, right, of how you do that without it being like a totally public database that anybody can access it. That's not what we want. We still want privacy, right?
But I think probably like the shining example of this is Wikipedia.
Mm.
I mean, I mean, we can all remember in grade school when Wikipedia was not to be trusted.
Right.
It was not to be trusted. It was like actively like shunned by our teachers. And now it is probably one of the most reliable places to get cited information. And I think like they have done this wonderful job of curating who gets to touch this open world of theirs. But I wonder if you're not a non-for-profit, like how do you actually facilitate that? And another example that comes to mind, and I don't quote me on this, but like loosely this is what's going on. IKEA is almost set up like a foundation.
Yeah.
So do you want to better explain this?
They have this like weird corporate structure where the company of IKEA, the cash flow producing entity, is wholly owned by this nonprofit that has like this very strange governance structure where nobody is in charge of the sole ultimate beneficiary of the entity. So IKEA, the company, has like a CEO, as I understand it.
But no one's. But this is the wonderful thing: is like no one's selfish. Or the idea is that like everyone that's working there isn't truly incentivized at like a monopolistic layer, even though they're the largest like wood buyers in the world.
I was about to say the same thing.
Which is just
the
like
net
wild.
Result, right? Is scale, baby. Like,
I mean, it's just like it's a beautiful thing. You know, say what you want about IKEA, but like their top line furniture, it's well built.
Get back to me when you're consuming 3% of the world's annual timber production, right? Like
drumstick companies are like.
And I think actually, guys, that's a really good example of this theme of like design and I guess you could say a little bit less cynically than power, like design and leverage, right? Is that like these well-designed products, one of the things that the organizations that produce them seem to have in common is they have this like really thoughtful way of aligning the economic incentives with the production process with ultimately like the mission. You know, you think of IKEA, you think of Apple, obviously.
I mean, Apple's latest thing is like ask app not to track. And suddenly it's back to what you were saying, which is like companies that control the experience versus the data are going to win. Well, Facebook's not much of a company unless they are mining you. And when they're not allowed to mine you anymore, well, that sucks because like what are you actually? What are you if not like a data mining company?
Yeah, Facebook especially. I won't go on my Facebook rant. It's not terribly original, but you know, not a whole lot of original technology happening at Facebook. I'll leave the metaverse thing aside too, but yeah, you know, going back to the open source angle though, there's a challenge in open source that I would actually love to hear your thoughts on how it might be overcome, which is the open source community is almost all developers by nature. Where's the designers? Because the design of open source software, not great by and large. And there's, again, economic reasons for that as well. But when I was in city planning, I used GIS software a lot, geographic information systems, spatial data analysis, things like that. And the big corporate juggernaut in that space is Esri, also a defense contractor, who created ArcGIS. Right. And it's a very, very expensive piece of software that city planning departments use for this kind of work. The alternative is open source called QGIS, and it is free, and there's a very vibrant open source community around plugins and other kind of things that you can build into it. And it's wonderful. It's a really, really, in fact, in a lot of ways, it's better than ArcGIS and got better over time. And there's other examples, I think, of that where the open source competitor begins to actually outpace, the corporate, standard bearer of that technology. But the design it's gotten better. But when I first started using it in the late aughts, it was rough. It was really hard to use. And the learning curve was very steep. And I think that's a challenge across the board for a lot of this stuff is, okay, great. Composability, interoperability, high ceilings, but not low floors. Right. We need both. And so there's a composability angle, but there's also a usability angle. And when I think about design for emergence, language is such a really rich metaphor for understanding this space. I mean, Christopher Alexander's A Pattern Language is sort of a starting point for me, but it can be applied to all sorts of things. We could do a whole other episode on Christopher Alexander if you'd like. That'd be a lot of fun.
We will.
Thanks. That'll get a lot off my chest. But in constructed languages, conlangs, Esperanto, these languages that are developed often for a purpose, either it's to be super efficient, maybe it's for entertainment value, Klingon, what have you. But in a lot of cases, it's the idea is, okay, this is a language that we can use for a given purpose. And one of the sort of core ideas in conlangs is to build a language that is kind of follows the meta rules of natural languages. And in natural languages, there's this idea of the International Phonetic Alphabet, the IPA. And you could imagine this is like a periodic table of phonemes. Every sound that has ever or will ever be enunciated by a human mouth is on this periodic table. Super fascinating. And I hope I get this right.
Yeah, right.
It's wild.
I wonder what the soundboard is like in the studio.
Yeah. The subtle nuances of ways that different languages enunciate different phonemes and not to mention just dialects within a language, but totally fascinating. But every naturally occurring language follows a relatively similar pattern when you chart it on the International Phonetic Alphabet, this periodic table, so to speak, which is columns are organized in terms of where a sound is coming from, if it's coming from the throat or if it's the front of the mouth, etc. And then the rows, I believe, if I remember this correctly, are different mouth shapes, so to speak, which is, how do we manipulate the sound that's coming out of that different point. And almost every language in the world follows this really similar pattern where it will only have one or two, maybe three columns. There's a ton more than that. But the sounds will come from very similar places in each language. Some languages are more nasally up front, some are more glottal. And then they manipulate that sound different ways. That's a usability feature. It's highly composable. Obviously, you can create infinite meaning out of these phonemes if you combine them into words and sentences, etc. But it's also usable in the sense that the language isn't asking you to move the source of your vocal expression rapidly in any sort of way. So it's highly usable and it's highly familiar. When you want to create a language, a conlang, a constructed language artificially, you follow that pattern. You don't have a ton of different sources for that sound. You follow 1, 2, maybe 3, and you manipulate from there. That makes it more user friendly. And so there's sort of like the ergonomics of these Lego blocks that need to be taken into account. And that's it's so important too. And the familiarity of these Lego blocks. A lot of times what people do when they start to try to design this way is they're like, oh, let's come up with entirely new Lego blocks. It's like entirely new phonemes. But if you're trying to use a constructed language or build a constructed language that is approachable for people that they can use, you actually want to start with incredibly familiar Lego blocks or phonemes, choose your metaphor here, and then combine them in new ways. So you want a limited set of blocks that can combine in new, interesting ways. And that's how you get, innovation from that. Because again, Brian Arthur, technology comes through combinatorial evolution. I think there's a lot of insight to be drawn from that when we think about how we design these systems that empower people to do more, even if they don't necessarily have the technical expertise that, a computer programmer might have. And so I've drawn a lot of inspiration from language in that way. And I think it's a useful guidepost.
So
that's beautiful.
Yeah. The question you asked though about like, why is it that
design isn't
and open source, this is sort of something that we also have been sort of puzzling about. And I mean, not to reveal our cards too soon, like, there's some stuff that we're actually scheming on trying to, explore some applied solutions to this problem. But like, long story short, there's like, who is it, the author of Working in Public, the Stripe Press book, and Nadia Asparova, I believe, she like wrote about like the different models of open source like software production, and how there's like I think one of them was like the arena, where it's a whole bunch of observers watching like one person do some really epic like work. And I feel like one of the things that's hard about like design within open source is that it's there's like this architectural question that I think all good design has to confront. And open source has figured out how to do that from an engineering perspective, but I don't know if that same process has really figured out a way to live in design. And I mean, I think some of that is like, Figma's like community section is a step in that direction. If there's more open source design artifacts,
like material design. Like I have like a few like hunches as to why, but to your GIS, I mean, I think like everyone should be whipping out city skylines too. Come October 24th. Not sure if you. We could talk about that. But when it does come to like open source and like why designers aren't really involved in the community that much, I have a few hunches that come to mind. One, I think like that you have like your surface designers that don't want to get in because open source is naturally hacky. It's naturally just like very this is what we're putting out, and it's not going to deserve like the fit and finish that I could give it because I have my day job, and all the 20,000 engineers around the world also have their day job, and this is what we do as a passion project on the side. Yeah. And designers really maybe don't want to touch something that they know is not going to be like polished or that's ever evolving when they also have to keep their full-time job. That's just a hunch. But then you have like some of the more senior designers that are on the research side, the ergonomic side, like the underbelly to design, like, what you and I would do. I think like potentially there is like an inherent roadblock because a lot of these open source projects, they're done asynchronously, and design is very much a communal sport, right? Yeah. And so maybe there's something there, but I don't know. Like, what do you two think? Like, because I don't have really a good answer for you. I think like there's definitely been direction or like steps in that right direction around like Mateus Duarte's material design efforts. Wonderful. I think like, but that was like a very tangible output. Yeah. Then you have like one of the first examples that comes to mind is like Frog and IDEO's design thinking, the sprint, right? That's giving something to the world. That's open source. It's like constantly being, fine-tuned. But past that, I don't know. I don't have a very good answer.
Here's kind of like, if I had to speculate on this, because it's like, it's a very, what you're almost trying to describe is like, you're trying to give an account for the absence of something, which is maybe like one of the hardest sort of like epistemic claims to catch. It's like, what's the shape of a ghost? And you're like, okay, amorphous, right? Like it occupies the space it's trying to fill, right? Like, but like for real, it's like I think
a pretty good answer.
That I mean, gases and some fluids, I guess. But like if I had to pin it down on like one thing, or not one thing, but like try to build a causal story, one is that there's fragmentation, right? That is we're now just coming out of that. Like there are so many different ways of building a desktop application. There were so many ways of building software that like a lot of the open source projects up until like the web started standardizing some common interfaces and runtimes for software. A lot of the open source projects were actually like very brainstem level, like in the software stack, that they were like things like operating systems or things that ran within the command line, things that really only worked in Unix environments, right? So there's like a lot of like the majority of the machines in the world for a long time were Windows, and open source software that was shipping, unless it was targeting web, couldn't really run on Windows devices. So Windows was this weird like it wasn't like grandma's village in the old country. It was like a strip mall with like a casino, and everything was like branded and all this stuff, like very corporate. So first is like we needed this shift towards more open standards being the place where software was running, right? And that was a really long journey. When we got there with the web, and I mean, like, shout out Gordon Brander. He probably has a lot of opinions on this, more I think than any person I've really encountered. Like front end frameworks. There was the jQuery dynasty, right? Which sort of like lasted, the jQuery Sultanate lasted a solid like like about like 7-8 years. And then there was like this like warring frameworks period where it's like, oh, is it going to be a Backbone? Is it going to be Knockout? Is it going to be Ember.js? And like, or is it going to be what? React. React ends up consolidating the tribes on like the broad steppes, and like getting the hunters together and be like, we're coming for the palace, right?
Sometimes I think it's the only thing propping up the share price, but
I mean, like speaking to actually, Kasey, like what you said of like not too much technology getting developed at Facebook. React, I would say, is their crowning technological achievement.
That's a good point.
And it consolidated how interfaces were built on the web, and the web consolidated like a platform that open source developers could use to be like, we don't need to figure out how to run this on a Windows kernel. We can just run it on the browser, and if it's Firefox, if it's Chrome, if it's Safari, for the most part it'll work, right? Okay, we're now there with the state of open source. On the flip side, up until when did you probably know this, you two know this more intuitively, when did Figma Community launch?
I don't have a precise date, but it was like maybe at like Figma's half-life. Dude, I would imagine.
Right. And we were at Claire in 2017, and Figma was still in private beta.
Yeah.
You still had to get an invite, right? Yeah. Like you had to know somebody on the team to get access to Figma. So Figma itself was the first sort of multiplayer design interface, right? So like GitHub, think about what GitHub did for open source. What was open source like before GitHub, right? And design didn't even have a GitHub until Figma got out of private beta, right? And now we have the proprietary Figma file format. Mateus Duarte and the Google design systems, and design systems now becoming a first-class concern, more and more design systems getting open sourced. I would say we might actually be like just in the beginning of open source as a commercial project.
And what's really sad about that even still is like when you look at some of these, I'm just using design guides because that's the most relatable, but material design is not truly open source. You write into them saying like, hey, the padding here is off, but like the padding here is off or something, and then Google's design team is like, okay, I agree or I disagree, or maybe you submit that with maybe some data backed up, but more or less it just goes into a black hole. Same thing with like a lot of these community files, maybe developed by like UI8 or like, Ant or like, Tailwind. Like a lot of it is just kind of going into a black box. And controversial opinion, but like I think a lot of like visual designers are actually holding back the idea of designers getting into open source projects. Why? Because like good engineering, how you construct code is very black and white. It either runs more efficiently and faster, or it simply doesn't with inferior code. With design, there are so many ways to go about the right thing, but to get there is a very subjective process, even if you don't know it, right? Like that's the whole point of design thinking is it starts off subjectively, but it ends up in an objective place. So
well, in a much slower feedback loop as well, right? If your code doesn't work, you're going to know immediately. Once it compiles, at least. And so I think that actually is maybe one other contributor to the dynamic we're talking about, which is for a lot of engineers, I mean, coding is kind of just, it's a video, not just a video game. It's like a video game. I experience this when I start getting into developing whatever tool I want to build. You kind of get into this video game mindset where it feels like, you know, the solution to this particular little nefarious problem is just around the corner. If only I could give it another few minutes, I might get it. And then wait a second, there's another problem. Next thing you know, of course, it's 3 a.m. And you get this sort of satisfaction of feedback loops very, very quickly when you're developing, that you don't get in design. You don't get that immediate feedback. Let's schedule a user study next week. That's not nearly as, I mean, and of course that's going to confuse us even more if we don't do it right. Also, it's not necessarily that super clear black and white, it worked or it didn't work in the same way. So, I think that's a really good point. Agree. I love the idea of Figma as a parallel to GitHub for designers. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that, to your point, that feels like it unlocks a lot of potential, and it's really exciting. I love that.
It also, it's just something I've been thinking about with Figma community. And, you know, as you guys know, I sort of come to the design discipline with this like engineering background. Like, it also makes me wonder, like, I know the team. Fun fact, like I originally, when I was trying to get into like my first job in tech was in design, and I actually interned as a product designer at Esri, which, you know.
I did not know that.
On their open data team, and they just didn't have that much work for me to do that summer. And halfway through, you know, somebody I think on the team during one of the stand-ups found out that I could code and was like, "Wait, you can code?" And that ended up being like the reaction I would get every single time. Like I was in a room with like designers, they'd be like, "Wait, what are you doing here, dude? There's like a giant sucking noise over there in the engineering department. They need hands-on keyboards, right?"
Nice.
But like, it does make me wonder with something like Figma, where this is where the analogy does break down, is that GitHub does not have a proprietary .github file, because there's so many programming languages that from the beginning, for them to sort of consolidate their various sort of like parts of the open source community, they had to support markdown or syntax highlighting for multiple files, right? Git as a sort of software tool is very agnostic about what its version control version controlling, right? But Figma, kind of inheriting from the Adobe tradition, even before they realized that they might be like marrying each other, Figma ended up really like setting out to own the file format. That these otherwise open. And I don't know if that's something intrinsic to the fact that like version control for fundamentally visual artifacts.
I think they could, though. They were in a position to actually do that, because they came to the table with two brand new ways of designing. One, making engineering handoff way easier with the JSON file, right? Then you had collaboration. These are two things that were massive pain points. Stakeholders didn't feel like they were involved in the design. Okay, let's get in the file with the designer. And then, or like really it's for like marketing teams first, but now stakeholders are now in there, which is great. And then the second complaint was from engineers and designers, right? Like, shit, like how am I supposed to like hand this off? That diffuse shadow is not really like working for me. And now you just toggle on dev
Dude,
in Figma, and then boom, like
remember
everything's.
Sketch?
Yeah, oh,
Remember trying
I
like
try not to.
yeah,
It's like the most awkward growth. It was like, you know what it was? It was like puberty between Photoshop and Figma.
yeah, but at the time, Sketch felt like the second coming,
Yeah.
and like, but trying to get and engineer a Sketch file was like nightmarish, right? And trying to, as an engineer, I was kind of on both sides of this equation, trying to get like uh, the CSS styling and the stuff needed out of a Sketch file compared to like what it is with Figma.
And what's crazy is like, I remember when Sketch came out, the most pronounced feature was the redlining, because in Photoshop
Oh yeah.
you had to basically make two mocks. The first mock was of the actual design, and then you had to make a layer where you had to manually redline everything. And it was
the grid layers.
it was
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
And then you had to anyway. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Like yeah,
Right. Like and then Sketch brought like Snap to Grid as kind of like
snap to
a
grid, and then
native,
also like all you had to
UX.
do is just like press one key to see the relationship between,
Yeah.
So it just like
But it is something, Kasey, I wonder about, like, and it would be very interesting to hear like folks from the Flux Collective, shout out Flux Collective, their take on this. Like, why is it that Figma has this proprietary file format? I don't think that that's an accident, right? I'm sure that it was deliberate from inside of the org at Figma. But then there's like the second question, which is there a day that file format becomes open sourced? Is there a day that there are other file formats that have to coexist? Like, will GitHub for Design ultimately be Figma, or will GitHub for Design be what, like, will accept among its many file formats Figma files as well?
That's interesting. I mean, there's obviously an incentive for a proprietary file format. But I don't know that that's a fair explanation, because there is the double-edged sword of open sourcing something like that, or becoming file format agnostic, which is the lack of control that Figma would have over the capabilities within those files, and the system at large. And that's a legitimate trade-off. And I can imagine that, when they were developing it and making these decisions, I'm sure that was a conversation, but they chose to push it as far as they could, and that required maintaining some control. So there's constantly trade-offs in these kind of things that go above and beyond just what it looks like on the surface. And I would be curious what those conversations were and where it's going, and if there is a way to open source the file format, for example, while maintaining enough control over the product that they can continue to expand the affordances that are available within the experience. It certainly makes it harder, right? I don't know.
Okay, so Kasey, closing it out.
Let's do it.
What are 3 points of advice that you have for the forlorn founder struggling to find product market fit?
Learn how to interview people, truly. And I mean, I think a lot of people, they think, well, that's so easy. Why? Like, you're just talking to people. But I think the art of asking open-ended questions and follow-up questions that actually don't assume anything, but move your interviewee closer to the area that you want to gain information from, and listening to them and letting them guide the conversation because they know it's important, not you. That's an art form that I think is a little bit underappreciated, and it's certainly not one that's widely held as a skill. It's very powerful, and I think that for founders who want to find product market fit, the ability to do that will make life so much easier. So I would say at a really tactical level, developing that skill is really important. I would also say at a slightly higher level, maybe this is number 2, is to just momentarily, and you probably already have a technology that you're excited about. You probably already have a product idea that you're excited about. But if you haven't done the work up front to set all that aside and explore your user and their context agnostic of all those factors, try your best to do it. Try to forget about all that stuff just long enough to have some of your assumptions questioned in the process. It's really easy to fall in love with your ideas, and I think if you can just step away from them for a moment, processes like interviews or contextual inquiries or any sort of research method you want to apply, formal or informal, becomes a lot easier to gain insight from, because you're not wedded to an idea. You're opening your mind up. The last one, this is a little bit of a curveball, maybe. Study complexity theory. This is sort of, I'm really convinced that there is incredible interlaced opportunity between complexity theory and the application of design that is relatively underexplored right now. I know we didn't talk a lot about complexity theory per se in this conversation. The design for emergent stuff is kind of what I'm gesturing at with that. But I think there's, we'll save that for part 2. But look into the Santa Fe Institute and the stuff that they put out. Look into systems theory, a la Donella Meadows, read Christopher Alexander. These are people who have been kind of exploring the intersection between complexity theory and design already. But I think there's so much more there, and if we can dig into that, I think there's a lot of real opportunity for founders and technologists and designers alike.
100%.
Kasey, this has been like, I feel like I'm talking to a professor. It's just like, this has been awesome. I've learned so much. And there's a bunch of markers in this video that we're going to have to just like call out maybe for other episodes, or just sure. Thank you so much. You've been so generous. Guys. Also, the game is called Rummy Cube. I just remembered.
It's called Rummy. There you go.
That's a good callback.
Shout out Rummy. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, Kasey. And we'll see y'all next episode.
See ya.